So hello everyone. This is probably a bit of a different setup, me starting than what you'd be used to. For the two people who probably don't know at this stage, my name is Caolan McCarthy. I am a speech and language therapist and an autistic person. And I am the proud son to the proprietor of Autism Journeys, Sharon, who's sitting across from me. And we have a very special interview today as part of Autism Awareness Month, looking specifically at older adult diagnosis, I suppose, of autism. Um, and the reason that I am in the interviewer seat and Sharon is in the hot seat is because she's actually going to be speaking about her experience today. So I have to say before we start that I'm incredibly proud of her for how far she's come and the work that she's done and continues to do, not just as far as a professional goes and as far as the way she contributes to the autism community as a whole, but as far as her own personal growth. I think that she's come a huge way, and I'm very, very excited for ye to all hear about the wonderful autism journey that she's been on herself. So without further ado, how are things?
All good. Now, I suppose the only thing I'll say is that I'd like to think that I'm not an older adult autism diagnosis. So we might consider that maybe middle age,
fair enough,
rather than older.
I'll trust your judgment today, I suppose. So just kind of getting into kind of the meat of things. You recently went about an autism diagnosis, or you've been going through the process of receiving an autism diagnosis. Can you talk to me a little bit first, just about the kind of things you noted, or the things that maybe drove you to, or convinced you to go about that kind of diagnosis for yourself at this point in your life, I suppose?
Yeah. So, Caolan, you know the story, I suppose, for everybody else. I became an autism parent back in 2009, 2010, officially for the first time, and one of you guys were identified as autistic. Following his identification, I went back to college and I spent many moons studying and sussing out and kind of learning as much as I could about autism and about ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions and so on. And I suppose over my time studying, and the more I learned about autistic individuals, how different individuals will present, about their profiles and so on, the more I started going, well, actually, I wonder, do I tick some of these boxes? Does this make sense? Oh, okay, so people are talking about eye contact. I thought I was the only person who didn't feel quite so comfortable like making eye contact all of the time. I thought that I was the only person who, because I was very chatty and always talking and so on, that I wouldn't meet any kind of a criteria for an autism diagnosis, because my understanding up to that point of autism was quite literally that it was children and young people who were much less likely to converse with strangers, for example, and that they were much less likely to make eye contact full stop and so on. And I suppose as I started figuring things out and started understanding you guys as you all, we'd say, stepped into those your individual autism diagnoses, it was only then that I started going, well, actually, this kind of makes sense for me.
So, like, again, well done you for recognizing those signs, and well done you for having the confidence to kind of go about it and take that step. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the kind of process that went into that. So I know that you've spoken to me about needing to go about two different assessments, say, or two separate assessments. So can you just talk a little bit about almost the timeline and the process of assessment that you went through, what it was like, and maybe a little bit about why you decided that you wanted to go about a separate assessment later down the line?
Yeah. So I suppose first and foremost, I went to a conference about 2.5 years ago, so the Autism Europe conference, and I met the lovely Dina Gassner there. Now, Dina is this absolutely vivacious, wonderful, full of life autistic female. She is one of the co-authors of Spectrum Women Walking to the Beauty of Autism, I think is what it's titled. And I remember meeting her as we were going to a black tie event, having a conversation, and her asking me in her wonderful American accent, so when did you get your autism? When were you identified as an autistic female? And me going, oh, well, actually, I wasn't ever identified as an autistic female. Now, I remember Dina saying to me at that time, well, if you ever want to go about an autism assessment, I can sort you out. I can set you up with somebody who will actually be able to identify you very, very quickly. Because in her eyes, I reminded her quite a bit of herself with the chat and with the talk and with the kind of socially motivated type of presentation, so to speak. So I suppose that was sitting in my head for a while. And I suppose it was the first time that somebody had actually said to me directly, well, yes, you are absolutely an autistic female. Previously to that, I had different kind of college lecturers and so on saying to me, God almighty, have you ever thought about going about something? But not, I suppose, not clearly laying out for me what they kind of saw, or whether or not I kind of made sense to them for whatever reason. So I suppose following my meeting with Dina, like all was good, and we hit the pandemic. And I found that actually that the beginning of the pandemic, I felt very much like I was sat like everybody else in the world, thinking about, okay, so how long, how many months, how many years, how much time have I wasted with being unkind to myself, being very overly critical, giving out to myself all of the time, calling myself different names, saying things about myself and to myself that I wouldn't ever in a million years dream about saying to any other human being or to one of you guys or whatever. So I suppose I found that the pandemic hit, and I was kind of like many other people, I was very, very anxious and worried. And I kind of went, you know, I'm not sure how long this is going to go on. I'm not sure which way the world is going to go. And actually, if I'm on the earth for a year or another 10 years or another 50 years, I choose no longer to be unkind to myself. I want to be kinder to myself. And actually, like, if I'm autistic, I'm autistic, and I can't be beating myself up for being who I am. As a parent, I really try to support all of you guys to kind of be your authentic selves. But I felt that I wasn't being authentically myself. So I said, you know, I'm going to go about an assessment. So in March, the end of March, start of April 2020, I went about an autism assessment. Now, I was expecting a yes, and I answered all of the questions. I had a Zoom interview with a local clinician. And unfortunately, at the end of that assessment, she said, absolutely, you are absolutely autistic. I see this and I recognize this. But unfortunately, I was met with, do you really need that bit of paper? I don't think I'd like anybody to know this about me. Do you actually need this piece of paper? You don't really need this piece of paper. I'm telling you this. And I nearly had to kind of say, well, yes, I really do need this piece of paper. But actually, I suppose the piece of paper came via email, and it was really marred. It was really marred. It was really negative. There was a real kind of a negative energy around it. And because of that, I kind of felt it just didn't sit right. I didn't feel empowered to be kind to myself, and I didn't feel empowered to be my authentic self. So I continued, even though I said, I shared with my closest friends and with my family members, obviously, that this is what had happened, but I wasn't happy to share it in public, because absolutely it wasn't that I was ashamed. It was that I just felt so, I suppose it was just positioned so negatively for me.
I
And
suppose.
and it was, yeah, no, it was absolutely just to do with the fact that this was delivered in a shameful way, in a negative way, rather than actually, this is information about you. This means that you understand yourself better. And so you can figure things out. You can figure out how to facilitate your own needs a bit better, and to recognize your strengths the same way that I try and do with you guys every day. I suppose following on from that, so 2 years passed, almost 2 years passed, and I came upon an advertisement for the Neurodiversity Hub in Australia. So the wonderful Barb Cook, another author of the Spectrum Women Walking to the Beat of Your Autism book, and Barb and I would have interviewed Barb for the show many moons ago. Now Barb is a really kind, really gentle, really gorgeous energy, and I kind of felt that, you know, if I'm going to figure myself out properly, and if I'm going to be as authentic as I can be, the best thing I can do is I can sit and I can actually go about another assessment with somebody who navigates these kind of things from a neuroaffirmative standpoint. Now, just previously to that as well, one of you guys, as you know, Caolan, was identified as an ADHD mind as well. And I suppose up to that point, my understanding of ADHD would have been a kiddo who was bouncing off the walls and running constantly, and that kind of Energizer Bunny type of presentation. I suppose when one of you guys were identified as an ADHDer, it suddenly made sense to me, because they were identified because of this real busy brain that they've got, this kind of real busy, intensely thoughtful brain that their brain never stops. And I suppose when I was thinking about them, I was kind of looking at myself going, oh my gosh, how many times have I stumbled over my words because my mouth doesn't go as quickly as my brain does. I know I speak really quickly, and Irish people tend to speak quickly, but actually I speak much more quickly than the majority of Irish people as well. And I suppose that's sometimes because my brain is kind of processing thoughts really quickly, and then I am trying to catch up. So I suppose when I spoke to Barb, it was absolutely lovely to speak to her. And within a couple of hours, we did great chat, great. She did all of the typical tick box exercises and so on. And at the end of it, she said to me, Sharon, she said, I will send you on the paperwork. Absolutely, I will send you on the paperwork. But she said, I can tell you now, you're not only an autistic brain, you are also an ADHD brain. And what I think was really wonderful for me was that she said, she literally said, actually, you remind me so much of myself. And these are like, I mean, isn't it wonderful that we are both so similar, and that we both have these strengths, and I can see your brain processes very quickly. And this is why you're so able to do this and so on. And suddenly everything was framed more positively. And it sounds kind of bonkers, Caolan, insofar as I tell you guys all of the time, like, I mean, in this house, I do try and tell people all of the time how amazing you are, how much I love you guys, how much I love your unique profiles and personalities. And yet I equally needed somebody to say that to me in order for me to actually step into who I am. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I suppose even just coming at it from the perspective of somebody who was kind of around you for this whole process, I remember the kind of the self-talk and the dialogue that was going on while you were kind of in that transitionary period between the two assessments, where we spoke actually a couple of times about doing this interview,
Yeah.
where we sat down and I kind of talked you through your process. And every time we did, I remember you being very uncomfortable and uncertain and unsure, because in your own words, just didn't sit right. Um, and I remember the kind of the disappointment almost that came with that, because it took you a very long time to go about that assessment. It took you a very long time to kind of reach a point where you were comfortable in going about the label, and to hear somebody speaking about it and speaking about you and the wonderful person that you are in kind of almost a derogatory sense, I know was very hard, and I know it kind of prolonged that period of self-discovery and self-acceptance that you had to go through, because you didn't have somebody who, like, obviously the couple of friends and family who knew were all like, woo, go you, but like that doesn't have the same impact, I suppose, as somebody who is outside of your bubble and has no motivation to say it,
Yes.
only that they're telling the truth. So I think that I have been so thrilled by the kind of the change in you and the change in your outlook on your own diagnosis, since you had somebody speaking to you in a more affirmative way about it and treating you like a person about it rather than a nuisance. And I think that it makes complete sense from the perspective of somebody who, again, had time, even though there was voices around me telling me that I was wonderful and I was great, and I like it was a brilliant thing type thing, who took that bit of time as well to kind of settle into their diagnosis. So I think it's really powerful to hear almost from you, that journey and the kind of strength that you had to kind of almost persevere through that first diagnosis and that first negative experience in order to get to the point where you felt accepted for who you were. And I think it's really important. It's a really important thing for people to hear, I think, because somebody who has a negative experience and who's querying something like autism, it's important they know that just because you have your negative experience around the diagnosis, even if it's not this kind of perfect tell-all or this piece slotting in, that doesn't mean that it's not a part of you. It might just mean that you had the wrong person communicating with you.
Yeah.
So I suppose following on from that kind of looking at things from a negative perspective initially because of the talk around it, to going instead to the positive. Could you kind of talk to me a little bit about some of the positives that you've experienced since you received that second diagnosis? What are the positives of that diagnosis for you, I suppose? And
No, I suppose, Kel, the reality is this, is that when you are stuck in a cycle where you tend to view yourself quite negatively, it can be quite difficult to break that. But I can definitely see a breaking in that cycle. I can see a more gentle and kind approach to myself. We'd say the negative judgmental self-talk that I've engaged with previously has definitely lessened. I won't say stopped, but it is definitely lessened. I suppose it is me knowing for sure from a positive standpoint about being autistic has made me step into my job as an educational advocate, my job as a trainer, my job as a person who supports autistic people and families and so on, step into that space with all the more passion and with all the more certainty. I suppose I definitely find that suddenly that I'm not sidestepping different pieces, but that actually that I'm utilizing my autism identity or diagnosis to connect with other people, particularly particularly in a work standpoint and in relation to young people who I support. So I think that's really positive. But not only that, everybody who's ever listened to the show knows that I'm a mom to multiply identified autistic kiddos. And to anybody who doesn't know the show, my family, my children are my absolutely greatest achievement, regardless of what I ever achieve. You guys are what matters most to me in my entire life and in my entire being. And before my acceptance of my autistic identity following that wonderful assessment with Barb Cook, I was trying to encourage you guys to be as authentically autistic as you could be, just to completely step into being who you guys are. Unfortunately, when you are speaking and saying words, but you're not modeling what you're actually saying, it doesn't carry that power. Suddenly I find that I'm not only saying it, I'm now modeling it. And because I'm modeling it, I've got gorgeous little people and yourself and older people and so on, who are suddenly starting to step into who ye are, authentically speaking. That I find that kiddos in this house who potentially would have spoken a little bit more derogatory or unkindly about themselves, that suddenly that they're starting to kind of go, well, I don't care what anybody else thinks. There's this lovely transition and kind of move towards that complete self-acceptance piece for everybody in the house. And I suppose from that standpoint, as a parent, it's really wonderful to see you guys empowered to be yourselves and to actually just be yourselves in spite of any judgment that you guys might come up against, and to showcase who you are to the world, regardless of the negative voice that you might come up against from time to time.
Fantastic. And again, as somebody who's been around this process and as somebody who has been indirectly or inadvertently, I suppose, been allowed to be more accepting of themselves because of that process and because of the work that you put in to kind of understand yourself, I can confirm that it does make such a huge difference when you have, for lack of a better term, when you have a role model for how you can accept yourself and how you can look at all of the parts of yourself and really use them as a way to understand you rather than a way to criticize you.
Yeah.
So it is wonderful. And I suppose my last question then for you is in two separate parts, because I think it is quite normal for people who are surrounded by autism or immersed in autism to potentially query their own position as far as autism is concerned. So the two parts of this question, I suppose, and there might be similar aspects, but would be how, or what one piece of advice, or what's the most important piece of advice you could give to, first of all, a parent in an autism household who is querying autism and who is kind of looking at themselves and ticking the boxes. And second of all, to a clinician who might be working with autistic clientele, who might be immersed in that world in a very different way, but who might still have that kind of niggling thing in the back of their head, like, oh, maybe I should go about something. Maybe these things are making more sense to me than I would have given them credit for initially.
So I suppose I'm going to start with clinician side, if that's okay. And I suppose first and foremost, to any clinician who is looking to assess autistic, potentially autistic adults, recognize first and foremost that no adult goes about an autism diagnosis because they don't feel autistic. No person goes about looking for an assessment because they want to create an identity for themselves that isn't true. The reality is that, from in my experience at least, that I've spent many months. I've spent like all of my life not quite, like, always trying to navigate things and trying to figure things out and being maybe a half a step behind many people, if that makes sense. I didn't go about an autism diagnosis because I wanted a label the same as my children had a label. I went about an autism diagnosis because that was what actually sat with me, and it is what I suppose fit best for me and for my experiences as a person who has lived more than 40 years on this earth, if that makes sense. So I think first and foremost, any clinician out there who is to do an autism assessment, recognize that if a person is coming to you around an autism diagnosis, that it is absolutely necessary that you validate their experiences, that you validate their reasons for coming, that you never, ever, ever meet them with judgment. And that the most appropriate way to let a person know that, yes, they do meet a diagnostic criteria or whatever, is to let them know that you see them, that you hear them, and that you actually see their amazingness. You see them just as they are, without judgment always. Because if you come at this kind of a process with through the lens of judgment, you are potentially derailing any positive journey that the person can go on as a result. So I kind of think it's really, really important that you do that. I suppose from a parental perspective, it's really, really important. For any parent who's out there, they're questioning whether or not they might be autistic or not. It's going to stay, that feeling is going to stay there. It's going to continue to niggle. It's going to maybe dissipate for a little while, and then it's going to reemerge again, and so on and so forth. It's really important to recognize your experiences and to trust your judgment in your experiences, to recognize the importance of minding yourself, and to recognize the importance of validating your internal conversation. If it's the way that anybody like myself sat with a real kind of a negative internal conversation going on, it's so much better, and it's so freeing to be able to dispel and to dismiss that negative conversation that's going on. It is so empowering to be able to do that. As an autistic parent, I've definitely, and I suppose as a person who has been able to step into my role, not as a parent, but as an autistic parent, it has empowered me to become a better parent to my children. I kind of think that anybody who's going about an autism assessment or looking for a diagnosis, it's so important that if this that you know that if this sits and if this kind of feels right for you, that regardless whether or not you meet somebody who dismisses you or invalidates your concerns, that you continue to seek, you continue to look around and to seek out somebody who actually organizes some kind of an assessment process that validates you as a person, whether or not they identify you as autistic or not, if that makes sense. I think that from a mental health perspective, the greater level of understanding we can show ourselves and the greater level of understanding we have for ourselves, the more mentally well we become, and the more mentally well we stay, if that makes sense. And not only that, by doing so and by allowing ourselves to be our authentic selves, we also model for our kiddos how to maintain and remain mentally well as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's very consistent with not only your experience, but my experience as the child to an autism parent, and an autistic parent as well. I think it's been wonderful. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, thank you so much for taking this step and sharing. I have no doubt, I know that it's been a wonderful experience for me to see you grow into yourself in this way. I have no doubt it's going to be wonderful and so helpful to parents who can so often dismiss themselves, in favor of supporting their kids through things, when in actuality it makes such a difference to their kids when they take a second to look at that kind of self-care piece and that self-acceptance piece. Um, and I think I speak for the entirety of the autism community when I say welcome to the family.
Thank you, Caolan.
Okay. So keep looking and keep your eye on Autism Journeys. I know this is again something that Sharon would probably normally do, but because she's in the hot seat, you can find her on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, on her website at autismjourneys.ie. She does so much good for the community. She offers so many different wonderful, varying services, and honestly, from a professional and a personal perspective, I don't think there's anybody else that you'd be better positioned to be working with. So thanks very much, Sharon, and we'll talk to you soon.